For this year's Festival of Archaeology, we've come to Portsdown Hill on Portsmouth's northern boundary. The hill runs from Bedhampton in the east to Fareham in the west and has been the site of human activity for hundreds of thousands of years. The earliest known site is at Red Barns in Porchester on the southern slopes of the hill, where hand axes were made around 200,000 to 425,000 years ago. The hill has spectacular views for miles around and has been the site of warning beacons, a naval telegraph and possibly even a Roman signalling or lookout station. We're going to be taking a look at some of the hill and a few of the archaeological discoveries that have been made here.
Okay, so Portsdown Hill is a chalk ridge that extends about 5 or 6 miles north of Portsmouth, and of course chalk itself is the result of the deposition of marine algae over millions of years, millions and millions of years ago, 90-odd million years. And of course it forms a nice thick layer, hundreds and hundreds of meters deep, but over time the compressed chalk was being deformed by geological movements as Africa moved north and collided with Europe. It sent ripples through the landscape, and Portsdown is one of those ripples which caused it to fold up and form the ridge we see today. It's part of a range of chalk features that go through the entirety of southern Britain and into France. So it's sort of a ripple in an ancient sedimentary layer.
This was the site of a prehistoric and Anglo-Saxon burial ground that was excavated last century during a series of roadworks to improve the road junction between Portsdown Hill Road and Southwark Hill Crossroads. The first discoveries were made in 1948 when workmen widening the crossroads came across the skeletal remains of a number of individuals. They informed staff at Portsmouth Museum, and they subsequently carried out an exploratory excavation together with the Inspector of Ancient Monuments. They dated the remains found by the workmen, together with another skeleton that was excavated, to the Anglo-Saxon period, but they also found evidence that this area had been used as a burial ground over 2,000 years before, during the Bronze Age. 4 prehistoric pits were found, 2 of which contained cremation burials. One of these dated to the Middle Bronze Age and contained the remains of at least 2 individuals. The remains of a slotted incense cup were found in the grave along with the cremation, together with 107 shale beads and 16 amber beads. These had probably originally been strung together as a necklace. A lignite button with a gold cover was found point down in the centre of the cremation. In 1972, another Bronze Age burial, this time an inhumation containing the skeleton of a young woman aged between about 15 and 17 years old, was found together with 2 pottery vessels. The remains were carbon dated to around 1325 BC. This burial, together with the cremation, may originally have been covered by a barrow, although no evidence of a barrow was found during the excavation. We do know that there were a number of barrows on Portsdown Hill, including within the area of Southwark Crossroads, although none of them survived after the Second World War. When the road junction was changed in 1956, workmen came across more skeletal remains on the site. Staff from Portsmouth Museum Service and the Inspector of Ancient Monuments carried out a second excavation, during which they uncovered the Saxon cemetery that was here. This is thought to have been an early Christian cemetery dating to around the late 7th century AD. One of the Saxon burials had been placed away from the other graves, in between the 2 prehistoric cremations. This was thought to have been an adult male, as they'd been buried with a shield, and the shield boss had survived in the grave. Around 70% of the Saxon burials were of adult males, the rest were women, and there were also some children buried here. One of the skeletons showed evidence of a violent death, with this individual having received 3 blows to the face and another to the leg, probably by use of a heavy sword. Just down the road from Southwark Hill is the site of another prehistoric and Saxon burial ground near the George Inn. In the late 1960s, the London Road was moved from the west to the east side of the George, and a flyover was constructed. An archaeological investigation took place in 1966 and 1967. Antiquarian sources had reported the discovery of burials within the area over a century earlier in 1816. According to contemporary reports, around 12 skeletons had been removed by workmen who broke into a barrow when quarrying chalk. The description of the site and burials suggests this may have been a Neolithic long barrow with a secondary Saxon cemetery. No trace of a barrow remains today, but historic Ordnance Survey maps show a barrow on the west side of the London Road. In 1967, archaeologists uncovered 2 Anglo-Saxon burials and 2 parallel ditches to the southeast of the George Inn. The burials were 70 feet apart and both were on an east-west alignment. One grave contained the remains of a male around 25 years old. This individual appeared to have been buried in a coffin. 3 iron knives had been placed over the left hand. A small iron buckle was also found in the grave, and the remains of a small bronze-bound wooden bucket against the left shin. The second burial was of a young adult, although it was not possible to identify the gender. This individual had been decapitated, probably by a sword or similar type of weapon, and the jaw had been fractured by another blow. There was no evidence of a coffin having been used, and no objects were recovered from the grave. The 2 ditches were found to the south and east of the graves. They ran west to east and were 425 foot and 141 foot long. The function of the ditches isn't known, but they may have formed a boundary to a Saxon cemetery which started further to the west, where the burials were found in 1816, and which included the 2 burials found in 1967. A further Saxon cemetery was excavated on Portsdown in the 1970s at the Neolithic Long Barrow site known as Bevy's Grave at the eastern end of the hill. The London Road was the main route into Portsmouth for travellers approaching from the north for centuries. It runs north to south across the hill, descending the southern slope at Cosham. It was from this point that travellers would have had their first glimpse of Portsea Island and the surrounding area. London Road was part of the Sheet to Portsmouth Turnpike that had been set up by Act of Parliament in 1711. A turnpike and toll cottage was located just to the north of the George Inn at Purbrook until 1871. Coaches ran regular services from Portsmouth to London, and by the 1820s there were 4 scheduled every day, including a night coach. At the top of the ridge to the west of London Road, a naval telegraph station was erected in 1796. This was one of a chain of stations that relayed messages between the fleet at Spithead and the Admiralty in London using semaphore. The station on the hill communicated with a station on Southsea Common, as shown in this watercolour, and a station at Harting Down to the north. The hill has been used as a vantage point throughout its history. A warning beacon was located here in the 16th and 17th centuries, most notably lit when the Spanish Armada was sighted in 1588. In 1979, a Roman pit containing post holes was excavated to the west of the Southwark roundabout. It has been suggested that this may relate to a Roman lookout post or signalling station that would have communicated with the fort at Porchester.
I'm stood on one of the many trackways and other earthworks that crisscross the hill. It's presumably a trackway that once connected people as they crossed over the top of the hill and went down into Portsmouth, and obviously going in the opposite direction. But the hill itself is crisscrossed with these little features, and it's quite tricky to work out exactly what caused them and how long they've been there. But they add to the character of the place enormously.
Richard, would you like to tell us a little bit about the feature that we're standing in at the moment?
It's a very good question. We are stood in what I think is a preparatory training trench that was constructed between the wars to give people some practice at preparations for the Second World War. It's a zigzag feature extending sort of 100 metres down the slopes of the hill. So it's got, according to the people I've spoken to, some features that characterise it as a military preparations. Even if it was used as merely practice, it would have had some defensive features, because there was a time, of course, when they thought Portsmouth would be invaded, and it would have helped to some extent defend the slopes of the hill. So it is a subject for some discussion and research, I would suggest.
Of course, this is one feature that survives above ground that you can see, and there are a number of other Second World War and earlier defences recorded for the area of the hill. In particular, there were some zigzag trenches up around near the Southwark roundabout that were destroyed in 1956. when the new road junction was put in there. So we know that there's been a lot of activity connected with defence within the Portsdown area.
It's also true to say that there were defensive structures associated with the radio masts above the chalk pit, and the infrastructure for those is still there. So the entire hill was, over a period of time, has been one defended and fortified structure. I'm standing in a bomb crater that was generated by the Luftwaffe in the early years of the war. Portsmouth is littered with bomb sites, but most of them have since disappeared. This is one of the few that remain in situ, and this is a small part of the actual shell that landed. We've cleared it now, but it must have made a remarkable impression at the time. As far as I know, there are no other bomb sites on the hill, but it leaves a bit of a legacy, as you can just see.
During the Second World War, an underground radio station was located in tunnels dug into the hill at Paulsgrove Chalk Pit. There would have been large radio masts situated on the hill above. The station was connected to the underground headquarters at Fort Southwark, from where the D-Day landings were coordinated. Evidence relating to the radio masts can still be seen on the hill today. This metal stake would have acted as an anchor point for one of the cables that secured the masts. A series of metal posts nearby may have secured a barbed wire fence connected with this site.
My name's Richard Jones. I work for Portsmouth City Council, and my job is to look after Portsdown Hill, or certainly the wild and interesting areas that are up here. It's a large area, about 100 odd hectares altogether, a mixture of flowery grassland and scrub and other habitats to comprise a rather valuable piece of natural habitat for people to come and enjoy right on the edge of Portsmouth. The most significant feature of the hill is the flower-rich chalk grassland. It's a relic fragment of the habitat that used to cover most of the chalk of southern Britain, and it's particularly rich in orchids, in many species of flowers, insects, different sorts of pollinators. It's a really valuable and rare habitat these days. Now the management of it is such that you have to basically stop it turning back into scrub again. So the valuable flower-rich grassland is now maintained through grazing, through scrub clearance, and it basically is now in a much better condition than it was maybe 30 years ago. So we've been busily working away, reducing the amount of scrub and some of the trees as well, so that it's largely an accessible, easily negotiated open space. I'm ably assisted with a team of about 20 people who come out at various times, and we get involved with the necessary vegetation management, which is obviously nibbling back at encroaching scrub, and a fair bit of litter clearance and estate maintenance. In order to stop the animals that we use to graze the site, we have to maintain the fences and the infrastructure such as the gates and the footpaths. So as a team of 20, and sometimes number goes up a bit, but we've got about a large squad of people who come out and do a lot of very good work for the site. What we've got here is a plant called a knapweed broomrape. Now broomrapes are a group of plants which have got an interesting strategy in that they don't bother going through the faff of using chlorophyll to get their nutrients. They pinch their nutrients from other plants. Its roots plumb into the roots of this plant, greater knapweed, and it thrives on that. So it looks like something like a mutant toilet brush, but it's actually quite an interesting and rare plant. Portsdown Hill, a large part of it, about 50 or so hectares, is a site of special scientific interest, and it has such a designation because of the assemblage of plants and insects. The major interest is the short species rich grassland which dominates the site, but it's also the mosaic of scrub and other habitats that make it particularly interesting. There's a couple of hundred species of plant and probably 1,000 species of insect, and that's without seriously counting, so it's a very biologically rich place.